I'll bet you've all heard of the big bad wolf, the call of the wild, and all those stories about wolves. But have you heard of sea wolves? They're sometimes called coastal or marine wolves. Well, you're in for a treat today. Chris Darimont, he joins me. He's the professor at University of Victoria. He's the director of science at the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. And you guessed it, he's a leading expert on sea wolves. And wait to hear what Chris has to say about these guys. These amazing animals, they live up on the west coast of Canada by Vancouver and Victoria. Now, here's the crazy thing. Their diet is over 80% from the sea. They literally hunt for sea life. Now, get this. They many times swim, not dog paddle, swim up to 7 miles between these islands just to find food. Now, did you see the documentary Takaya Lone Wolf? It's a definitely must-see if you haven't seen it. Now, here's some tidbits. They eat tons of salmon, but only the brains because the rest of the salmon body is unhealthy for them. But by doing so, they give food to other predators and they help fertilize the Great Bear Forest. And also, get this one, they literally dig for clams. Now, scientists are working closely with Indigenous nations as an integrative approach to protect and better understand them. The Indigenous nations call them family and treat them as family. So the sea wolves are not allowed to be tagged or captured. Now, these amazing swimmers are endangered by logging, climate, and trophy hunting. And we're going to get into all this. There's so much in this episode. Now, here's a crazy one. These mythical animals are believed to bring good luck and wealth. So I hope after listening to this episode, they too bring you luck and prosperity.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today I have one that I've been dying to do, and you guys are wait to hear the story. My guest is Chris Darimont. He's an expert in sea wolves and a bunch of other things. Chris, welcome to the show, and I can't wait to get into this story.
Me too, Mark. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, I don't know what the temperature. You're in Victoria right now, I'm assuming.
I am.
Yeah, I'm in Austin, but today, for Texas, we don't get a lot of cold weather, but it's like, Fahrenheit, it's 28 degrees the high today. So I feel like I'm in Canada myself.
Oh boy. Yeah. Honorary Canadian today.
Well, I tell you what, I should be honorary anyway. I've drank plenty of Labatt Blue.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's not our best work.
I liked it. Anyways.
Did you?
Oh, yeah. I'm a big fan of Canada, regardless of what you hear these days from down here. But most of us are big fans of Canada. So I'm really glad to have you on. But what I thought we'd do is I want to get into sea wolves, but let's get into your background, how you got started and how you got where you are today. And let's just go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my journey started about a quarter century ago now, which is strange to say out loud. I was, undergrad in biology and on the adventuresome side of the continuum for young students. And growing up with a dog, I think, was really influential. And I just wanted to do work in big wild places with big wild animals. And I set my eyes on wolves. And actually, my first start was in the Rocky Mountains, working on a project out of, close to Banff, Kootenay National Park, and learned some mountain skills and snow skills and tracking skills and radio collar skills. And that was great. But being a West Coast kid on the coast of BC here, it was my vision and dream to get back to the coast, and in particular into the rainforests north of Vancouver, a very, very special place called the Great Bear Rainforest. And it's a big chunk of Western North America that is almost completely without roads, very low human population density now, and specifically after colonization and all the harms that did. But regardless, very little industrial disturbance, very little roads, very few people, and it's the domain of things like these beautiful sea wolves. And so I made some moves to make something happen there, and that was about by that time 20 years ago, almost to the day.
Well, a couple things. One is, I think what I read, you were in Canmore. Is that where you were?
In part, yeah. I actually lived in Kootenay National Park at a little
Sure.
warden's outpost.
Wow, that's cool. You know, Banff is probably one of the most pretty places I've ever been. It's so gorgeous there.
Yeah,
So, but I tell you what, but Victoria is that whole part of the world is gorgeous. So, the crazy thing is, when I was getting ready to do this and I was doing the research, a lot of people don't even realize that there's actually an animal called a sea wolves, and that's why, and it's fascinating to me. So, you chose them 20 years ago. So let's kind of go with that journey and how
sure.
what you've been doing, and just go with it.
Yeah, I remember I showed up to a public presentation of a little nonprofit called Raincoast Conservation Foundation. And I had dreamed about the coast and wolves on the coast, but I didn't really know what that looked like, if you know what I mean,
Sure.
until I saw a photograph of this wolf in the middle of summer. It had lost lots of its thick guard hair, outer winter coat, and it was lying curled up in an estuary,
Mhm.
gorgeous river mouth with sedges everywhere, and in the background, these ancient temperate rainforest trees. And I just thought to myself, that's it. That's kind of my vision manifest right there. That's what it looks like. Um, who are these Raincoast people? And it was at that time a very small nonprofit, and they took a chance on me. I took a chance on them, and basically it's been a journey together for the last 20 years, developing a science program on behalf of Raincoast, and also in conjunction with my kind of day job, which is a professor of wildlife conservation and science here at the University of Victoria. So, it- I took a chance on something that was small but had great potential, and I'm sure glad I did, Mark.
Well, first of all, I love your use of words so you can visualize everything you're saying when you're talking about it, which is really great, by the way.
Oh, that's
It's
nice.
really cool,
Oh,
but
good.
what a great job you have. I mean, not only teaching kids, which would be awesome, or I'm sure there's adults as well, but well, they're adults, young adults, let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah,
But also to spend all that time in the wild up there, because like I said earlier, and of course I'm preaching to the choir, God, it's just so beautiful out there. And Victoria Island itself is just gorgeous.
yeah, yeah. It's a it's a privileged life for sure. We're working with young people, spending some time in the bush. I mean, less so now. It's more my graduate students get the quality bush time. But several times a year, I head up to the Great Bear Rainforest and connect with not only that place and the wildlife like the sea wolves, but also the people. Um, of the Great Bear Rainforest, and specifically the Indigenous nations, the groups, the communities, the villages that are up and down this coast that themselves have very strong cultural relationships with wolves, uh, and much knowledge, of course, about wolves and other creatures of both land and sea. And increasingly, as they reestablish their governments after the disruption and violence and disease, et cetera, of colonization, they want to do good things to protect habitat and food supply and other things that, things like wolves, and ultimately we all depend on. And so my role is a relatively small one on a big team of people that includes decision makers from these communities that increasingly have the agency to make wildlife management decisions, graduate students, Raincoast and the conservationists and campaigners that work for Raincoast and others. And it's a beautiful thing 20 years later that we can do work not only on wolves but other important um, creatures that are of high ecological, economic, and cultural value. Things like salmon, um, the the remaining elk populations of these rainforests. The grizzly bears and black bears, and even the white form of the black bear, the spirit bear that um, is in these rainforests, and other creatures, including actually trees themselves. We do some work in that relates to forestry decisions. So it's still every bit as exciting now as it was 20 or 25 years ago. And a lot of people doing the fine work are the graduate students with the community members.
Well, one of the things I like talking to, especially when you're dealing with Indigenous people, is it's the spiritual part of it and the mythology that comes with it. I did a thing. I've done several animals, like obviously the buffalo for the Native Americans here, but also the pink dolphins down in the Amazon area.
Yeah,
And there's
yeah,
all these stories that come there, and those always give it. I love stories, and some of the stuff I was reading about the sea wolves, and I know you're doing a lot with bears. You do a lot of big carnivores and that, as I understand.
that's right.
Yeah, so let's talk about the history of the sea wolf. And I mean, it's crazy some of the things they do. I mean, how far they can swim and all that. But let's just kind of get into their history and where they are now, and just kind of go on that trail.
Sure, yeah. Well, sea wolves is a common name that we give these wolves along that strip of rainforest that interacts with a very productive eastern North Pacific. Um, you know, all the resources that the ocean provides, the terrestrial environment, including things like wolves. So in the context of a daily life, or so let's say a yearly experience of a wolf, that in the fall we may reasonably assume they're on the salmon streams eating a bunch of salmon. They may, by virtue of being close to shore in that fall or later, certainly during the winter, they are capturing and eating a bunch of shoreline associated marine mammals like harbor seals that haul out and become vulnerable, river otters, sea otters. There's a lot of data coming out of Southeast Alaska, just to the north of us, about how important sea otters can be in the diet of wolves. Um, doesn't have to be big marine prey. We have these sea wolves chewing up barnacles that, imagine a log on a beach that's saturated
Right.
with water and becomes really good growing conditions for either barnacles or mussels. And you can imagine a sea wolf kind of chewing on a log like that as we might on a corn cob. Just up and down, just sucking back the protein and food energy from invertebrates. Also birds, from very small, something like a gull, to very large shore birds like great blue herons wolves kill. They also are able to feast on um, carcasses of bigger things that come ashore, things like sea lions, even whales. We occasionally get, especially juvenile age classes of whales that wash ashore, which can provide, meals for a family group of wolves for a month or
Right.
more. Pretty cool stuff. And On the West Coast, in this Great Bear Rainforest, it's a giant archipelago, hundreds, or depends how you count them, thousands of islands. And so what we observe readily is wolves swimming from one landmass to another across island systems or island to mainland, etc. Um, to have enough territory to make their living. They require big spaces. So they're very marine oriented in their terms of their food, in terms of their travel along shorelines, across land masses, and more. And in part owing to this really different ecology and the different climatic conditions along the west coast of North America, they have adapted to this coast, and in so doing, evolved along a different route than wolves of more continental areas have evolved, so much so that we can detect this differentiation in their genes. That is to say, we have detected pretty strong divergence in the genetic makeup of wolves along the west coast compared to wolves in more interior sort of continental areas. So, and how they look, they're smaller, often imbued with this beautiful red tinge. How they behave and feed themselves, also different. And even, more than skin deep, they are different in their genes compared to just about every other wolf on the planet. So these sea wolves are very different, very special animals.
But they're like a subspecies of the gray wolf, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the subspecies lexicon isn't commonly used anymore. What we use instead, it's kind of a mouthful, Mark. It's not nearly as
That's
satisfying.
why I'm not going to say it.
It's called evolutionarily significant unit, or ESU for short.
I'll
And
go with the ESU.
isn't that a little better?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
way
right.
better.
So it's kind of like a multi-criteria designation where you look at across a bunch of different dimensions of a population, its genetics, its morphology, its behavior, its niche use, or resource use. And if they diverge to various threshold levels across several of these domains compared to another population, and so much so that kind of the acid test is so much so that they would not be exchangeable. That is to say, if we grabbed a coastal wolf and plopped it into an interior area or vice versa, those transplants would not do very well. They're so different. They have different morphologies that co-evolved with the prey types. They have different immune systems, probably, that co-evolved with different disease organisms within the respective domains. So for these reasons and more, we have pretty solid evidence that and written up in scientific publications about 15 years ago that this coastal group along the British Columbia coast and the Great Bear Rainforest, and likely beyond into southeast Alaska, are a different ESU, or evolutionarily significant unit.
I saw a thing, and a deal that something said Canada's newest marine mammal.
Yeah.
That's kind of a clever term.
Well, I will say thank you. I will say thank you for that, because we and admittedly tongue in cheek started referring to it as Canada's newest marine mammal, given this strong association with the marine environment. And
Sure.
we're not that far off, given that polar bears, which pretty much exclusively eat marine prey, especially pinnipeds, especially seals along the ice, and they're so dependent on the ocean and its resources, and have such strong habitat associations to the ice that forms on the ocean and coastlines, that they are technically considered a marine mammal and protected, for example, under Canada's Marine Mammal Act, that we reason that wolves are, and especially the ones that are right along the coastlines and especially on the outer islands, they are every bit as marine oriented as our polar bears. So why don't we claim that
I like it.
moniker too? Thank you. I'm glad you do, Mark. That's cool.
So one of the things let's talk about them swimming from island to island because
Sure.
they swim long distances. So how far can they do? I'm sure there's smaller distances, but in a long distance, how long is that?
Well, there's two archipelagos, smaller subarchipelagos along our coast that are very distant from the nearest landmass. One is right near the border with Southeast Alaska. Um, and there's a collection of islands that total about 230 square kilometers, maybe 100 square miles, which is about right for a pack of wolves, or what I like to refer as a family of wolves. That is, I'm going to convert to miles here. That the closest landmass is not a BC landmass, is actually an island in Southeast Alaska, and it's a good 7 or 8 miles out at sea,
Wow.
which is astonishing. And we
What's
know
water temperature there too? It's cold.
it can be quite cold. I'm a surfer, so I kind of
I am
know
too,
this.
by the way.
Oh, are you? Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But I only know it in Celsius. It's, the coldest is, 8, 9, and
So that's about 40 something degrees or something like that.
okay, it
Yeah.
can be warm as 12 or 13. Up here would be colder. It gets a lot of fresh water influence from some major systems that sweep down right basically along the border between northern coastal British Columbia and southeast Alaska, the Portland and Observatory canals, these big inlet systems that drain a lot of fresh water. So it's probably a little colder out there, and it's probably the reason that the wolves showed up on these islands, we believe, in 1996. They probably got caught up
Right.
in that current, because they're very low-lying islands, very boggy on the outer coast, not a lot of topography. So, only on the clearest of days might you be able to see this island group 7 or 8 miles out there. So not sure, how predetermined and strategic that voyage was. But so that's one example. And then about halfway down the coast on the central coast, there's another island that's much smaller, about 30 square kilometers, or maybe 10 or 15 square miles, very small for wolves. We had a pack show up there that had not been there ever in, modern memory. And that, excuse me, that pack showed up in 2007, and that's a good 5, 6 miles out at sea also. And strikingly, the first island group I talked about, and to almost a full extent, the second island group I'm talking about, have zero deer or very few deer or any other ungulate on that island. So, which is really fascinating because, well, in the first case, I don't think deer have ever reached that island. It was just that island system is just so far out there.
Right.
And in the second case, deer did reach the island, and there used to actually be very high deer densities until the wolves showed up and killed pretty much all of them. There's a few.
Well, they're kind of trapped on an island.
Yeah, that's right. And there's not much escape terrain on that second island. There's very little topography where deer can sort of hang out on steep slopes and avoid being eaten. Anyways, the point I'm making is that usually wolves are very, in other areas, other than sea wolves, are very connected to their ungulate prey, whether it be
Right.
deer, moose, elk, etc. Um, and indeed they are. They make a big chunk of their living, on other islands and on the coastal mainland off of deer, but highly subsidized by marine resources. But in these two cases on these outer islands, that they are surviving and having pups and doing so for decades in the complete absence or near absence of any ungulate, which is,
Well, and that's going to lead me. That's a question I was going to get to, but so I'm going to use your term wolf family.
yeah.
So when these families get on an island, regardless is that real far one up north or the one down closer to you,
Yep.
is that become their territory and they're the ones that are there and no other ones come and travel over that way? Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's right. So that far out there, it's I suspect that any other immigration by a dispersing animal would be either super rare or non-existent. So it's a rare case in which the space is theirs and theirs alone, and they don't have to worry about intruders or neighboring families or packs trying to take space for them. So it's actually a very different, strange scenario. And what it's done actually is make us realize that in part, this may be one explanation, that wolves may not actually absolutely need as much space as they take up
Right.
in their regular territorial claims, so to speak, in more contiguous, areas, that they can survive in one case on 30 square kilometer or 10 square mile island for years and years and create um, pups, etc., tells us that wolves may not actually need the space and that we think they make, and maybe they claim so much space because it's a part of the way they repel neighboring packs. They kind of need like a core space and a buffer around that in the real
It's like their
world.
moat.
Yeah, kind of like their moat. That's right.
Yeah.
And then I've just reminded myself there is one other extraordinary um, uh, thing that happened with wolves, and it happened a stone's throw away from my office here at the University of Victoria, and that is just about a couple miles to the east. There's a little tiny island, very boggy, no deer on it, but an extraordinary population of harbor seals that haul out around the island, and river otters, and the odd geese gets there, and so on. Anyways, about 10 or 12 years ago, a wolf came out of the bush about I would say half an hour drive, 45-minute drive outside of town, into kind of from some working sort of forestry lands where no one lives, and started cruising along the shoreline of not a small city of Victoria.
Yeah. Victoria's not small.
That's right. And then swam out to this island and started making a living, and lasted a full, I believe it was 8 years, living on basically a little rock that was only about, I'll do miles, less than 1 square mile.
And it was by himself.
By himself, poor guy. He was given a name, Takaya.
Poor that guy.
Well, actually, he did really well. Physiologically, he was gorgeous.
Yeah.
He was muscular. His coat looked fabulous. Yeah, he was given the name Takaya, which
Oh, I know about. I've heard about that.
yeah, Takaya's he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, the ending is a sad ending.
Yeah, we'll get there. Rest in peace, poor guy. But he had a fairly good life out there. He was, to be candid, harassed a bit or a lot by
Tourist.
otherwise well-meaning photographers and tourists and whatnot. The local Indigenous nation, the Songhees Nation, did their best to safeguard Takaya from harm, and that sometimes included some tough negotiations with British Columbia parks that had jurisdiction over about half of the island. So it was some delicate policy work there to make sure that people stopped bringing their dogs to the island and wouldn't do anything stupid like try to feed the wolf
Yeah.
there, etc. Even though a lot of people misbehaved over the years, he lasted about 8 years, and then probably because he was lonely and had a case of raging hormones in January. You probably know that unlike dogs, wolves only come into heat once a year,
Yeah.
and it's early in the new year, January, February, for a few weeks, and he left the island, swam to shore about a kilometer, about a kilometer, but it's very strong currents. Showed up on the coast of along residential neighborhoods in Victoria. Uh, Very quickly made the news because everyone has a cell phone in those days
Sure.
to record him. The conservation officers, our provincial wildlife people, trapped him in a very high density neighborhood. In fact, the highest density neighborhood of all of Victoria, called James Bay. Takaya was captured in. He was taken in overnight for a health checkup and surveillance, and released the next day from presumably the area from which he came, about actually it was closer to an hour and a half drive outside of Victoria. And we should have all seen this come,
Yeah.
and that he was no stranger to people. And in fact, some people tried their best to spend, as much time as they could with this wolf on the small island previously. And how much that played a role in the following is anyone's guess. But what happened was, within a few months of being released, he was on a road, and there was a houndsman, a cougar hunter, and he stopped with his hounds in the back, and I think he stopped, to take a leak or something on the road. And yeah, and this wolf was there, and Takaya was there, and not at all showing much fear response. And the guy moseyed back to his truck, took out his rifle. Wolves are the only big game animal in British Columbia for which you do not require a special species permit or tag. As long as you have a hunting license, you are allowed to take up to 3 a year in most parts of British Columbia, most times of the year, about 10 or 11 months a year. And that's what this guy did. Shot him, killed him. And that was a sad and maybe even predictable outcome.
Humans.
For humans, that's by far the commonest way by which a wolf dies in most parts of British Columbia, including on Vancouver Island, sadly. Maybe the exception being up in the Great Bear Rainforest, where there's so few people out there, and the people that are out there are generally not interested in hunting wolves. So,
Right.
anyways, poor Takaya, rest in peace. But he sure showed us what is possible.
It made world news. I kind of
It really did. Yep, there was a big TV special about it, and I'm pretty sure it was a National Geographic, and we did a little research project with the Songhees Nation, and actually a really nice undergraduate project to examine his diet, and sure enough, this guy was 95%, atom by atom, 95% fed by the sea. That's what his droppings told us, and that's what some chemical assays or chemical signatures in his hair taught us, that his hair and by inference the rest of his body was built by seafood, namely harbor seals, river otters, mink and little creatures like that are very marine oriented. So yeah, a hell of a story that he did last. I think a full 8 years on a tiny little half a square mile island that you can see from Greater Victoria. I mean, it's right in the thick of things. Like
Right.
it's in fact, right off of um, Canada's most expensive coastal real estate. So he had good taste in terms of scenery and real estate, to be sure.
For real, 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 for real.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
So I have a question for you. So when I was reading about them, it varies, and I think I understand why. Is that they say that in some percentage they say 25% is from sea life, and then it goes up to like 80%,
Yeah,
like you were saying him. So and I think it's the ones that are more on the islands that are more that way. Is that how it works?
that's exactly right, Mark. And actually, this is one of the questions we answered in my dissertation. Was revealing these what we refer to as biogeographic effects. That is to say that the geography really influence the ecology or biology. And yeah, wolves of the mainland coast, where there's lots of deer and actually pockets of goat and moose even, they make about 25% of their living on average from marine resources like spawning salmon and seals and mink and river otter, etc. You go to the inner islands, which are, adjacent to the mainland, not particularly far out there, but at that point we lose the grizzly bears, over which the wolves probably compete with salmon.
Right.
And there arguably maybe a few less deer out there, and the ratio becomes about 50-50. They make about half of their living from the ocean and half from terrestrial resources. And then when you get to those outer, boggy islands that in some cases have very few deer or no deer, they can make on average about 75% of their living from the ocean, and in some cases 95, approaching 100% of their living from seafood, like we saw in Takaya. And just that was stuff published, in the late 2000 knots, 2009, 10, and about 10 or 15 years later, we see some really beautiful data from an island and some adjacent mainland systems in Alaska, showing the same sort of patterns. And one island in particular, this family group seems to be very much specialists on sea otters, not river otters, but sea otters, the urchin eating,
Right.
thick coat, beautiful and very big. Actually, they're bigger than we think. Sea otters that are recovering from being extirpated or severely bottlenecked after the commercial fur trade, and they're bouncing back in big ways now. And the wolves are capitalizing on this resource now. So which makes you think, actually, like more broadly in space and time along the entire now what we can refer to as former range of wolves that at one point went into northern Mexico. They're gone. California, I guess there's a few there now, but they would have lived for millennia along the coastal strip in California, Oregon, Washington, south coast of BC, where they're now extirpated. Also, all the way up into Alaska, co-occurring with Indigenous peoples, but also with, sea otters before sea otters went the way of the dodo in most places along the coast. So probably they're kind of getting back to sea otters in a way that they may have always taken advantage of sea otters. So it kind of makes you think that, and it reminds us that some of the ecologies that we see now may not represent the ecologies of the past, or maybe we're starting to get some glimpses now of
A resurgent of the past.
exactly. So, anyways, these sea wolves are a nice window into thinking more broadly about historical ecologies.
So when they're getting, I'm sure they get a lot of it on the land, but I know, and I want to get into salmon here in a second. But like do they actually go out in the water and almost like fishing for these sea life too? Do they get them in the water too?
Not really, to be honest. Well, candidly, I've witnessed only the hunting of salmon in large numbers of observations, and they're very good at that. They don't use their paws like bears do, but they use they plunge their muzzle into the creeks, especially the kind of the terminus part of rivers that become braided and shallow, and the salmon are vulnerable. They're really good at that, and they have very stereotyped behavior across individuals and family groups, telling me and everyone that this is a behavior that's been around for a while. Everyone does the same sort of technique here. So that's clear with salmon. I've seen them. I've never seen them kill seals. I've seen them chase river otter. I've seen them actually chase seals and definitely river otters, and basically, seals, when they haul out, are vulnerable. I have seen them swim to reefs, essentially, a little ways offshore. So they do get in the water to approach the rocks, but I believe they really do need, some sort of substrate to hunt from, and haul out zones. And river otters, mink, etc., are scurrying around on the intertidal quite a bit. I don't know. Maybe they can do the odd dive and, for example, get a big Dungeness crab off the bottom. I wouldn't be surprised. I see grizzly bears snorkeling. We call it snorkeling behavior. They'll basically do a bit of a deep dive even to the bottom of a big pool where there is, freshly dead salmon, and bring it up.
Right.
And so, wolves are pretty bright, and so. And I'm really at the edge of what might be possible here, but a scenario in which they kind of go, into the drink to fish for things. I can imagine them maybe doing that with a big, delicious, Dungeness crab,
Yeah.
kind of swimming down to get it. Who knows? They continually surprise me.
Well, one of the things, let's get into salmon because they only eat the heads, based on what I read. And can you talk about that and why that is?
Yeah, it is. It is definitely a pattern. They do on occasion eat, dorsal, the top part of the salmon, the musculature up there. Um, but what they don't do commonly, which bears do very commonly, is go after the viscera, the guts, and especially the eggs of females, because that's where all the fat and calories are in salmon, relative to the flesh. But wolves seem, by virtue of thousands of observations of wolves, carcasses, seem to avoid that and target the head. So there might be one major reason why they're avoiding the eggs and the viscera, and that is because there's a little and we're not even sure how to classify it as scientists. It's a disease agent that's not really a bacterium. I forget its taxonomy, but it's a funky little disease organism, which in the veterinary circles is described as salmon poisoning disease.
Huh.
It itself hitchhikes a ride on another parasite that has salmon as an intermediate host and carnivores as a final host before it's kind of pooed out again by carnivores. And in the weasel family and bear family, that salmon poisoning disease is relatively harmless.
Right.
But for the canids, the dog family, it can be fatal. So much so that there is papers written in, I believe, the 70s or 80s, testing the efficacy or how effective that disease, salmon poisoning disease might be at controlling coyotes, like killing coyotes instead of using other poisons
Really?
that may be not as discriminatory or as so it'd be a highly targeted way to kill coyotes or presumably dogs. Anyways, we know this from the vet literature too, because some dogs that eat raw salmon can become very ill. So most of the literature is in the veterinary sciences. Anyways, that could be one reason why wolves avoid the rest of the fish, and especially the eggs that the bears go for. And they may target the head because, and we're speculating here, that the brain has a lot of calories in it. It's also got a lot of EPA, DHA, these omega-3 fatty acids that are very good for brains and vision and even the nervous system more broadly. So it could be a combination of avoiding bad stuff, getting good stuff, but it's kind of neat. Whereas a bear kind of just takes a munch out of and really just takes out the brain. Wolves have this fascinating behavior where they will put a paw on the fish, still kind of squirming away,
Right.
poor thing, and lock their teeth into the head and basically rip the head off cleanly at the gill arch. So they're very kind of cleanly decapitated salmon, and they'll chew up and swallow the whole head and shit out the jaw bones from the salmon, which is kind of really strange and wonderful and fascinating, and it's actually very convenient because it allows us to, probably not in a perfect way, but assign carcasses as we and others, especially salmon scientists, study the distribution of salmon carcasses in the forest left over by the large carnivores of the area. Those ones that look, cleanly decapitated, they assign to wolf as a predator, and those that have kind of munches out of the brain and the belly's torn apart among females especially, they assign to black bears and grizzly bears. So it's kind of a neat thing.
Well, it's really cool that the fact that they know that. One of the things I saw, I watched a few videos on them, and one of the things I saw where you got the wolves get the head, the bears come along and eat the body, but whatever's left, it becomes nitrogen, and the trees in that area are
Yeah,
bigger and better because of all the nitrogen from the fish.
that's right. That's right. I was just actually teaching about what we refer to as salmon forests and this beautiful web of interactions. And some of the big players in this system are the large carnivores that are the only things big enough to capture salmon, take them out of the salmon creek, by the way, after they've done a lot of their breeding. So it's not like it's these darn predators getting all the salmon. The salmon don't really become super vulnerable to predation until after they spend a while in the creek breeding and doing their spawning thing. Anyways, the things like wolves and bears come in, They take their choice bits of the salmon and leave, in some cases, a lot of the salmon on the forest floor for a whole host of secondary consumers and scavengers to do their things, from, smaller carnivores like mink or marten, to invertebrates like blowflies, even uh, uh, beetles to make a living off the salmon, and actually breed in salmon carcasses. They'll deposit a bunch of eggs, and the larvae will like be 100% fed by salmon, and those larvae get eaten by birds that are indirectly fed by the salmon or directly fed by the salmon. Then eventually, some of this carcass that remains rots, but also the nitrogen is recycled from all this web of consumers, from the invertebrates to the birds to the small mammals and the large mammals that poop out, but more technically, they pee out, or in the case of birds, excrete uh, uric acid, their form of urine, which is basically packets of nitrogen
Right.
fertilizer. So as you probably know, uh, we too have to get rid of our nitrogenous waste. So too do the bears and birds and invertebrates and small mammals, etc. After they eat the salmon, and what is waste to us, the nitrogenous molecules become, in some cases, readily available forms of nitrogen for the plants to take up. And it's really beautiful. And as you've mentioned, there's been some really nice work showing how trees closer to salmon streams, or even adjacent to common foraging areas along a stream for um, these large carnivores, tend to grow faster, bigger, healthier, etc. And it's in a really beautiful, loop or feedback here. These trees that are, and shrubs and herbs that are growing and fertilized by salmon end up either directly by dropping their leaves and needles into the creek, or indirectly by feeding a bunch of insects that are eating their vegetation, end up fueling the food webs in the stream, and the aquatic invertebrates that the juvenile salmon eat. So it's kind of cool that,
Circle of life.
isn't that circle of life
Yeah.
cool? So that, the new generations of salmon can thank their ancestors, whether it be their parents or deeper ancestors, for giving up their bodies after spawning, fertilize the riparian areas, and a lot of that energy and nutrients makes it back into the creek and feeds the next generation of spawning salmon. So it's a very, very cool cycle, and these sea wolves are one player, not as big a player as black bears in particular, because there's many more black bears in the forest than wolves, but wolves are definitely one of these gardeners, essentially, of the coastal forests, applying fertilizer to those forests.
Is there any sea wolves anywhere else? I know what I've read is there, but I was thinking, like, across the way in like Russia, because there's a bunch of wolf population there. Did they have
Mm.
a a,
Yep.
a group that actually does the same thing, that lives off the sea a little bit?
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't know much about that, but given I'm thinking Kamchatka, there would have been in Japan, coastal areas of Japan, Russia, Kamchatka, any areas that would have had wolves, and we got to keep in mind that in some areas, especially actually in more northern Europe, or Western Europe, there are no longer wolves, but wherever there were wolves, think about, before pre-medieval times, where there was wolves, in Europe along coastlines, probably essentially doing the same sort of
Yeah.
things, but with very different marine organisms in other parts of the world. So absolutely, I think wolves definitely have the what we refer to as plasticity, behavioral plasticity, to find a solution to the various puzzles, resource puzzles that exist or existed along a huge part of the planet. You may know this, that before, humans started really being hard on wolves, they were at one time one of the most widely distributed mammals on Earth.
Right.
And so I imagine, different sea wolves of different flavors, put it this way, being around for millennia until modern forces got rid of those beautiful, fascinating interactions.
One of the things that when you were talking about them swimming from island to the islands, it reminds me a little bit of the wild horses on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, because they swim to different islands and they live on islands.
Do they?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Neat. Very cool.
And they graze on these islands because what they're looking is for a food source too. But literally, these horses spend a lot of their time in the water.
Yeah, very cool.
It's really
Very cool. Yeah, a lot of the mammals are in fact really good swimmers, and so yeah, you can see that their evolutionary history would have shaped that ability to get in the water, because in so doing you could make your way to fresh patches of resources. So that's very cool.
Yeah, yeah. So before we end, a couple things I wanted to get to. I know that you have a class you teach with Western science and with Indigenous knowledge.
Hmm.
How's that applied? Does that involve with the wildlife as well, like the sea wolves? Is there some mythology or stuff that goes along with that?
Yeah, so I should have elaborated at the beginning about my journey. Coming to know these sea wolves. It started in the village of Bella Bella, which is the now kind of one and only home or village of the Hagsuk or Heltsik people, Heltsik Nation, and many members of the Heltsik, including the late Chester Starr with two R's, were really, really instrumental in helping our collaborative team come to know these sea wolves through the lens of Western science. They had, and still have lots of knowledge, Heltsik knowledge about these wolves with which they had coexisted and maybe even co-evolved over millennia with, and had stories about. And in one story owned by um, a particular family, the Housty family, and specifically by Norma Housty, is an origin story about how one of sorry, my computer was making a noise there. One of the tribes of the Heltsik peoples came to be, and in that story, the first Heltsik people were fathered by a wolf. So,
Oh, cool.
so the idea that Heltsik people themselves may be related, or are in this story and in the worldview of many, related to these wolves, and wolves are ancestors, and it kind of sets in motion how Heltsiks and others treat wolves. They treat them as we would want to treat any relative.
Relative, right?
Yeah, with respect and dignity, and
Right.
and recognizing their agency, and all these beautiful, instructive um, dimensions of a relationship, and that maps to how they want to interact with them in the modern day. And largely up and down the coast, there's no hunting of wolves for sport or trophy or hatred or any of that we see, commonly among, Western hunters and
Right.
Western resource management systems that have regularized and made commonplace, unfortunately, the sport hunting of wolves. So um, those values are a part of a knowledge system or a system of knowledges.
Right.
Many different knowledges that come from the Heiltsuk and other First Nations in the area. And so that was a big part of how we learned about these wolves, drawing from Heiltsuk and other Indigenous knowledges about these wolves and using the tools of Western science. And my graduate students and I continue to work with that principle and philosophy in mind, working with Indigenous communities and the governments of those communities. And one thing that I also get to do, and it's one of the best weeks of my year. Every year, I co-teach a field course in Heiltsuk territory with my sister by cultural adoption, a Heiltsuk knowledge holder by the name of Jess Housty, niece of Norma Housty, who owns that story that I referred to. And so, Jess is a descendant of wolves in her family origin story. So we work with a group of 15 to 20 university students for a week and a half every year at a very remote camp. And in the context of fisheries and wildlife management and stewardship, etc., we bring to the students our two worldviews, a Heiltsuk worldview and knowledge system that Jess brings, and my Western scientific training. And we look at some of the overlaps and parallels, but also some of the divergences and tensions and complexity that comes along with braiding of these knowledge sources. And we all have a great time, learn a whole bunch, and ideally get to see a wolf or two. Certainly we see grizzly bears and other creatures, and boy, it's just one of the best things I do with my life, that's for sure.
Well, I always believe we've got a lot to learn from people that know the old ways versus the new ways. Oftentimes, the old ways actually work a lot better than our new ways.
I'll say, yeah. On campus here, I teach a resource management course, and I start with these Western paradigms. In the fisheries world, there's a paradigm you've probably heard about or spoken about even called maximum sustainable yield or sustained
Right.
yield, where what is being sustained isn't biodiversity or nature or the fish population. What is sustained maximally over time under this paradigm are the yields or catches to humanity at the expense of nature. And it's paradigms like that gone wrong, and similar paradigms in the wildlife management world. Some very big mistakes Western managers made, especially as it relates to large carnivores and removing them from the landscapes. Buffalo too, exactly. That the history of Western scientific resource management, as sophisticated as we may think it is, and in many cases it is, its history is not something about which we should be particularly proud. It's littered with errors, and in fact, most of what we know about resource management science has come from the errors managers have made, historically, shallow historically in the last couple centuries, but even, to this day, errors are being made, and Western resource managers are captured by special interest groups that want the resources or don't want carnivores on the landscape, etc. And so I very much like working with Indigenous knowledge holders, communities, and their governments that, by and large, not always, but near universally have and express and live by and make decisions according to a very different set of values that puts front and center.
Yeah, it's not an economic agenda is generally what
No,
the other side is.
exactly, exactly. And then that's not to say that economics aren't important to First Nations. They are, but they are not the gorilla in the room like they are in other systems that have had too much agency for too long over the last couple centuries. And so in particular in coastal BC, where um, there was never any treaties, never any formal agreements made between colonizing governments and Indigenous governments, and therefore, even under Canadian law, some significant opportunities that First Nations are um, pursuing to, in some cases, very rapidly regain decision-making agency over natural resources. And I've basically yoked my whole career as a scientist on the prospect and beauty and value alignment that I have with what I see and have learned from First Nations in terms of their values and what they'd like to accomplish in terms of safeguarding biodiversity for biodiversity's sake and for all of our sakes. And so I'm really, really optimistic that in coastal BC we can do things differently from some places that are kind of paradise lost.
Right.
A little while ago I was speaking about the wolves along the California coast not too long ago, kind of a blink of an evolutionary in an evolutionary time span, a blink of an eye, and a lot of the biodiversity is gone or severely altered down there and many other places of the world. But it's really not too late in coastal BC if things keep trucking the way they are. I'm really optimistic, and yeah.
Well, I know you've got a class to teach you real quick. So, first of all, God, this is so fascinating. I love this subject, but like I told you, and everybody that listens to the podcast is already starting to cringe because this is the time to tell that silly joke.
Yeah, I love it.
So be prepared, and everybody out there, keep cringing,
Okay.
and we'll get to that in a second. So my joke of the day or little question is, what did the big bad wolf say after his workout?
Oh, I like this one because I'm a fitness guy. No, what did he say, Mark?
He didn't much to say. He just huffed and puffed.
I love it. I love it.
No.
As a huffer and a puffer, I love it too. That's funny.
Okay, so anyways, for everybody else who's out there listening, like I always say, I know you want to hear a better joke than my terrible jokes and all that. So if you have a good joke, if you've got a grandchild, your kids, you or whoever, please send them in. And I promise you I'll get back to you. Email me at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. Got a great idea for an episode. I'll get back to you. But seriously, please do, because anytime I don't have to tell the joke, I'm really happy about that. But anyways, Chris, thanks so much for being on. I mean, a wealth of knowledge. I know we could have gone on and on and on for a lot of different areas because you're an expert in a lot of other areas too. So, but most importantly, really, thanks for taking the time. I really know you got a busy schedule.
It was my pleasure, Mark. And for your listeners there, if they want to learn more, probably the best thing they can do, log on www.raincoast.org, all one word, raincoast.org, and that's Raincoast Conservation Foundation's website. Lots and lots of information about wolves. Raincoast was and remains the principal sponsor and home to a lot of the sea wolf science or all of the sea wolf science we've done over the last 20 years. So some beautiful photos, videos, even links to some of the videos we've done with, BBC, National Geographic, Canadian Geographic, discovery over the years, a lot of scientific papers, reports, etc. So I'd point people towards that fabulous resource.
Well, everybody, it'll be in the description too. We're recording now, but when it comes out, you'll have links to everything that we're going to talk about here anyways.
Super.
And then for everybody else that's out there listening, really, thank you so much for listening. Keep following, pass the word out. The more people to get on, the more opportunities we have to have new guests and all that stuff. But most importantly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.